our second seminar here. We've got Alan Summerford from Land and Legacy. It's going to be an interesting conversation. We're going to have his partner Kyle Lybarger from Native Habitat Project joining us in just a few minutes. He's running a few minutes behind, but we're going to get everything kicked off with Alan. So Alan, introduce yourself a little bit and let's kind of get on to this presentation.
All right, hey y'all, I'm Alan Summerford and from North Alabama. Grew up on a working cattle farm all my life. Got a farm right there in North Alabama with a lot of cattle. More of like a seed stock type producer, and I always had a passion for hunting. I always had a passion for outdoors, and we also had a farm down in West Alabama, and at the time we didn't have any deer in North Alabama at all. So driving 3 hours down to West Alabama and trying to figure out how to hunt and everything, and the more I got into it, just, you know, I wanted to get better. You know, it started out just we were shooting whatever kind of bucks. Then it progressed like, well, we want to shoot 8 points and progress, and like now we want to shoot trophy. Then it progressed, and like now I want to bow hunt and all those things. So I have gone down every rabbit hole that every kind of the big mainframe stuff they'll talk about on TV. Like, well, what food plot do you plant? What you know, all these different things to kill bigger and better bucks. And going through all of that, I've planted every single food plot species there is known to man, and tried to do all the different techniques, all the different stuff. And what I wound up coming to was that it really didn't matter that much about what your food plot was. You need good food plots, but that led me to native habitat. And so once I started understanding native habitat and started putting more focus into that, it kind of led me here. And that's when I kind of got buddied up with Kyle Lybarger, who's probably on the side of a road looking for flowers or something right now. But he started posting a bunch of pictures of flowers and all this kind of stuff, and I didn't really know what was what. And I lived 2 miles from my house, so I called him up one day. I was like, hey man, I got a bunch of flowers out here on my property. Y'all come out, you want to come out and look at them, see what I got? So he came out, we looked at some stuff, and I was cutting some timber at the time, and he's like, hey man, what are you cutting back here? And I was like, because the logger was just moving in and hadn't cut yet. I said, well, I want to create a savanna. He's like, oh, well, that's really cool. Like, you know, not many people talk about that a whole lot. And I said, yeah, this is kind of my goals. I'm going to try to start doing more native habitat. I've already been doing a bunch of burning and stuff anyway. And so we started talking and stuff. And he was actually a timber procurement guy. And he's like, well, let's go through your stuff. Let's look at it. And I was like, yeah. So we looked at it and everything. And I was like, well, I'm going to keep all my best big old white oaks. He's like, you might want to do that. And I said, why not? He said, well, you may lose some of your big old white oaks. You may start, you know, some of those are going to die. They're going to, you know, drop off. You may have a windstorm come, blow them all down, and you don't have anything left. I was like, all right, well, that makes sense. So we kind of started doing things a little bit different. I started cutting things instead of just a whole cookie cutter approach where you just go cut the whole property in a certain way, start chopping it up, actually being strategic on how it was cut, and then made it to where it's that much more accessible, that much more able to hunt it, being able to get, you know, better travel corridors going through the property. And then that timber cut kind of like set everything and like made it all come together and make sense. And then that's all the stuff I was kind of posting and stuff. That's how Land and Legacy kind of started seeing the stuff I was doing. They're like, hey man, we would like to have you come on and be our southern guy. So they're already covering like 32 states, and it's like, well, you're down there in the south. He said, we'd like to have you just kind of cover the southeast. And I was like, well, that'd be great. So anyways, that's what led me here. I started working for them, and we go across on properties, and we'll tour the property and see what habitat you have, what are you working with, kind of what are your goals, and then we go through the property and like make recommendations based off what you have, what you need to have. I look at what is around the property, what's the most limiting thing on the property, and try to make sure that we are putting whatever you're needing on the property and showing you how to do that. Not only we're showing you how to do it, we're telling you, you know, specific trees to cut, which trees to target to remove, which trees to target to just cut, which trees to target to promote, those kind of things. Then also managing your fields. We do a whole lot with like old field management where you're managing native habitat in old fields, managing food plots, you know, the whole 9 yards, but the habitat is what really brings it all together.
All right, so we got our introduction with Alan. Now, as we go through this conversation, again, this is going to be very focused on kind of our private land hunters specifically. But also something that I think we can bring up at some points is the education from understanding these different native browse species and how, as even a public land hunter, you can find and target specific species as well to be able to hunt. Now the man of the
Yeah,
hour,
absolutely. Like that's the thing that, you know, we're going and trying to create these habitat because we can manipulate it however we want to. Well, if you're a public land guy, you can't go and manipulate all that stuff. So like the things that we're trying to create on private land, that's the things you just got to go find on public land to be successful. So there's going to be some of that in here as well, like stuff to look for when you're out scouting your public land and everything. And Kyle, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, my name is Kyle Lybarger. I just came from a talk 2 hours away, so that's why I'm late. But, I'm with the Native Habitat Project and make a lot of content about native plants and native ecosystems. So.
All right, so creating usable space for whitetails. This is a property that I just came off of in South Georgia. It's kind of a typical recreational property, kind of what we see. It's a 200-acre property, and it was in a perfect square. And as you can see here, it's got a lot of pines. And it's got a few little hardwood draws. It's got a few little small, tiny openings that used to be just logging decks. The property had actually been thinned one time, and the trees were probably somewhere around that 25-year-old age. And the food plots that he had on the property, you know, you can see these openings on here, they're pretty small. So the food plots were really struggling. I mean, there's a lot of deer in this area, you know, really high deer density, and all of his food plots were lit high. And we toured this property probably sometime around, it was probably like late March when we did this property. Should have had pretty good growth out of his food plots by that time down there, and there was nothing growing. Part of that was because of the timber was just too close to the food plots and everything. Really didn't have enough space, didn't have enough food on the property. So what is usable space? 5 acres dominated with fall food plots, and what was trying to come up through there was bahia grass. You know, 195 acres pretty much was just timber, all close canopy. The little hardwood drains had some water oaks, American elm, maple, and sweet gum. And this is kind of what the pines look like. You walk in here, I mean, you can literally see hundreds of yards through these pines. Now, he had been on a burn rotation. He had been burning. He had burned actually the whole property, the whole 200 acres got burned 1 year prior to me being there. But this is what was there. January through March, what do you think their deer are eating on at that time of year in that pine thicket? I mean, there's really almost nothing. If you were to walk through that little pine thicket right there and try to pick up deer food, it would have taken you all day. And so we just really didn't have enough there. So in January, March, we need young forest regeneration, location where woody browse is available. April and June, we need early successional plant communities, young, tender, herbaceous vegetation. July through September, we need early successional plant communities, young, tender, herbaceous vegetation, soft and hard mass production. And October through December is hard mass production, young forest regeneration. So all these different aspects of the property are what we're looking for. All right, so how the deer were using the property. The deer basically had a big cutover on the right-hand side right there. We're coming into the property, swinging down right around this little point, and coming into his food plot there. They were using this little F's and Z coming down through here. There was a little bit of thick cover right through there in the middle right there. But the way he was accessing the property is he comes into the property right here, he drives right up through the middle, and he wasn't even using all these roads that are on here. But he's driving right up through the middle and coming in here and either hunting this food plot or hunting this food plot or hunting this little area right in here. So now we've got a 200-acre property. That's not a lot of space. If we're going to walk into our property and try to hunt the property and you're coming into the very middle of the property, where are you pushing deer to? You're pushing them off the property. Like that's the last thing we want to do. If we're trying to hold and grow mature bucks, we need to have an outside-in approach. And not every property that is possible to have an outside-in approach, but this property actually set up really, really well. And so we start designing roads where we're going to come in from the outside of the property and slip in to several different areas. We're going to cut the timber in a way to where we're going to start stacking deer into the middle of the property. We're going to have ways we can get into our food plots without spooking the deer, ways to get in around bedding without spooking the deer. Basically, we're just going to be like Mr. Wilson on Home Improvement. We want to reach up there, we're just going to be standing there and just looking into where all of the activity is going on. That's just a big old nice pretty food plot with edge feathering alongside of it. Cover along between there, we're trying to create more space that deer are going to use. So in that area that we had a whole bunch of just wide open pines, the whole entire property looked like that, with food plots where you just got straight tall trees, straight to small little tiny grass in the food plots. All right, guys, we want to be able to have cover throughout the property, and we're stacking this cover into an area that's right in the dead center of the property on each side of our food plot. And the type of habitat that we're trying to create is native habitat. All right, so these are the type of species when you're trying to create the native habitat you're going to be finding. You got beggar's lice, black-eyed Susan, whole bunch of this. This is not even all of them. But check out the crude protein levels in all of this. I mean, there's 20%, 60%, 23%. You're trying to get all this. People are trying to feed protein in a bag, and they're spending thousands and thousands of dollars to try to put what our native plants are already providing. When we're managing the habitat, we're also providing, structure. So you may go put 20-something% protein out in a bag, but that's not creating any structure on the property. That's not giving you anything for deer to actually bed in, lay in, live in. The other thing these do a really good job of is the phosphorus and the calcium. And so the bones are made up of phosphorus, calcium, and protein. So like, look at all these different levels, and that's what the deer will do. They'll go across the property and they'll pick and choose what's the best quality for what they need. And so all of these different things are what we're trying to strive for. Most of this is going to be found in old field or woodland. You're not going to see a lot of these expressed in a closed canopy situation.
And all those are also providing seeds for other wildlife. They're also attracting insects at different times of the year to feed baby quail, baby turkeys. I mean, turkey poults. They're providing a whole lot more than just deer browse, and that's what is so awesome about native habitat. They serve so many different purposes, and that's just a small portion of. I mean, there's
and that's not even getting to the cutting trees. So when you have a timber harvest, like everybody knows, like when you have a cutover, man, it's like a really, really good place to hunt. Well, the reason why that's a really good place to hunt is because you cut a lot of those trees. They're now stump sprouting back. They've got cover and food in the same location. Now you add that type of habitat across the property. So you put micro clear cuts throughout the property in strategic locations. Now you've got that exact clear cut, but now it's a 2-acre size as opposed to like maybe 100 acres. Well, when it's 100 acres, you can kind of hunt some edges and stuff like that, but you really don't have clear trails where you know where they're going to come and go. But when you take the smaller areas, like the little small clear cuts, and strategically place them, then you have a whole lot better idea of knowing, well, I can set up on here because I saw this buck go towards this direction. I most likely know he is going to be bedded in that bedding area. I hang up pretty close to that, then I've got a really good chance of seeing him again. Also, that property had 0 bedding cover on the property. I mean, they were bedding on it based on some points and stuff that they would bed, whether there's that on any property, but they're just randomly bedding throughout the property. Nowhere on the property could you go and say like, yes, that is deer bedding. And so adding all that into strategic locations through the middle of the property creates all these sanctuaries. And when we have all that in the property, like we can, if they're bedding on our property in daylight, bedding and feeding in that sanctuary in daylight, then when your food plot's 50 to 75 yards away, when they're going to get to your food plot, they're coming to there before it gets dark. A lot of people say like, man, my bucks are nocturnal. Don't ever see bucks in daylight. I get these really great bucks, but they're always nocturnal. Well, it's not that they're nocturnal. They're moving in daylight. I don't care what the property it is. They're moving in daylight somewhere. They're probably just not moving on your property. And so when we start adding all this into your property, they're spending more time on your property with usable space. And now when you hunt your food plot, you're actually seeing more deer come to your food plot in daylight hours because they didn't have to come from a mile away from another neighboring property that had the best cover to come to your awesome food plot. All right, so starting out with the property, when we first toured the property, we'll kind of break this down. The hardwood drainages, there was, some it had some mass-producing trees in there, a little bit of, herbaceous cover. I wish we had the picture to see that, but there's a little bit of herbaceous cover in there. It did have some cane, so there was enough structure there. It was actually, deer could walk through it and feel like they were somewhat comfortable. And so that was the travel corridor throughout the property. But it's not really high quality cover. It's not what I would consider deer bedding in. Like, it's not preferred bedding cover. It covered them enough to walk through, but it was not enough to hide them. But that only created about 1,680 pounds of food. So closed canopy timber, on average, produces about 150 pounds. And that's, give or take. Some timber doesn't even produce that. It's a lot less than that. And that's not even high quality. That's just something that a deer can survive on. So if you're thinking you want to grow big, mature bucks, well, you've got to provide the most amount of food, highest quality amount of food, and more than they can eat, because you're attracting a lot more deer too. You don't want to have just they're getting by on some smilax or something like that just grows anywhere. The pines, very poor cover, and it produced about 34,800 pounds of food. Like, this is over a whole entire area of the property. So as the farm stood when I showed up, there was 41,480 pounds of food on the 200 acres. One deer requires 1 ton of food per year. One deer. So if you do the math, you figure up how many deer can you house in that type of habitat. It's not very many. And it's still, like I said, that's just food. That's not high quality food. That's just them surviving. That's not them thriving. Like, they're going to have some times where they're not really going to have, especially in pines, they're going to have some times where it's going to be pretty tough for them to make a living on. They're going to lose weight. They're not going to have the ability to hold their weight and start growing the rack sooner. They're having to go through the year stressed, depleted, then build their fat reserve back, their weight reserve back, and then worry about trying to grow antlers. All right, so after we do the work, 236,000 pounds of food on the property. So we took the hardwood drainages and we did light TSI in that. So light TSI would be about a 30% canopy opening. You walk into the trees, not every tree is going to be timber. Not every tree is going to go in a log truck. Even if you have a logger come, there's going to be a lot of trees that's just not valuable. There's going to be a lot of trees out there that are not going to produce anything that deer will eat unless they are cut off. And so we go through and flush cut some like elm, ash, maple, dogwood, all those species like that. When they stump sprout back, deer absolutely hammer them. And so that's going to create not only food, but now when that stump sprout comes out, it's going to create almost like a bush light. It's going to have several stump sprouts come off of that one, and it's now you've got a little mound of cover that's about that big. Deer can bed up next to it, feed through it, and also travel through it. All right, when we start thinning the pines, that's going to start creating about 1,200 pounds per acre. It produces pretty good cover because you're going to have a lot of grasses, a lot of forbs, a lot of stuff start coming up through there. And so when we start doing that, I don't want to just do a whole cookie cutter approach like we're just going to tow that 200 acres and we're going to do a 3rd and 5th row thinning. That's what the majority of timber companies will do. If you've ever hunted on public ground and they're starting to thin some pines, it's going to be a big section of pines, 3rd and 5th row thin. Well, that produces some more habitat, but that makes it really, really difficult to hunt. If we do a whole entire cookie cutter approach with that, then you can't figure out exactly where they are because they're going to be willy-nilly walking through the woods, feeding wherever at will, wherever they're going to be. So we'll do different intensities of the cuts so that some areas where I want to be walking into my stand, I don't want to walk through really, really high quality deer habitat to get to my stand and just bump deer off the property. I want to be walking through a little bit less of good habitat and then have the really, really high quality stuff down towards the center so that when I walk through that, negative terrain, I'm getting through it and then setting up into the positive terrain where I think deer are going to be. All right, so the wildlife openings. Logging decks are phenomenal wildlife openings. They're going to be opening up a little spot in the timber anyway to set their equipment up. Those typically don't make very good food plots. The ground gets mashed in with all the logging trucks, a lot of debris there a lot of times. But what they do create is really good wildlife openings. There's going to be a mix of forbs and legumes that'll come up out there. You run fire, you run disc. Don't try to plant anything. Don't try to put fertilizer or anything like that out. All those plants that we just listed right there do not need fertilizer. They don't need any maintenance. They just need to be disturbed. And so those wildlife openings are not only creating deer food in the summertime and a little bit of cover, but they're also creating habitat for your turkeys. Turkeys are in desperate need of brood habitat. So most of the time on the landscape, there's almost no brood habitat, and that's why the turkeys are declining in so many areas. And so we're creating nesting habitat in some areas and then brood habitat in other areas. And these are awesome places for turkeys to be able to take their broods to, find bugs, find plants and flowers that are attracting bugs, and walking through there, they've got a little bit of structure and a little bit of cover and places that they can get escape out of and hide. And then we're going to do clear cuts. The clear cuts where I was talking about, you know, a 2-acre clear cut in some of these locations where it's strategic, that's going to create about 1,500 pounds of food and awesome cover. In these little clear cuts, you're going to have some trees that are hinged, some trees that are just flush cut. In a pine location, it's going to be a little bit different. You're going to flush cut all of them. Hopefully you've got some sweet gums in there. As bad as I hate sweet gums, but if it's the only trees you have is pine and sweet gum, you've got to use those sweet gums to be laid down as structure. And then if you don't have enough structure there, then you have to add structure, like planting switchgrass. Then the food plots. We're expanding all of the food plots. We're making them big enough to where it's not just a strip going through some pines where it gets about 3 hours of sunlight a day, and we're opening up these food plots. I mean, you're just taking a pine tree out, it's not that big of a deal. But we're opening up these food plots where they're actually sizable, where we can grow enough food to actually sustain the herd. Also, make them to where they're going to be bigger enough. They're going to be big enough that we can get in to several different locations and hunt them with different wind and different access. So now that we've done all of that work to the property, that's going to add so much. It's going to be 236,000 pounds of food. You're creating food that you don't have to manage other than just disturb it and maintain it. We're going to take fire is going to be our best tool to maintain it. We're going to run fire. We're going to have a mosaic of patterns like you saw those roads that were split up. Each one of those roads is going to be a fire break. Each one of those are going to be a different section that we're not going to burn the whole 200 acres at a time. That's what the guy did before, and he said, man, I had some decent cover until we burned the whole entire property all at one time. Now we lost all the cover. Now it's got to all come back at the same stage, and then when it does all come back at the same stage, well, now it's all at the same stage. We don't have anything to diversify or be able to focus on where the thickets will be. All right. So I skipped over a whole bunch of stuff on there, but this is basically what the property is going to look like when we got done with it. So if you see the purple areas, that's where we're going to do pine savanna. So in those areas, you know, I walked to the property in that northeast corner right there, northwest corner right there. The pines weren't really doing all that great. You know, he cared about the money of the pines, but they were really struggling. They were actually smaller than they were on the rest of the property, and I was like, well, you know, that's not going to be the greatest place for you to grow pines, but what would be really awesome is a pine savanna. So we're going to cut that area. We come in there, we're going to cut it really, really hard. We're going to open it up to where there's maybe 20 basal area at the most, and then that's going to create that flush of, you know, tons of sunlight to the ground, a huge flush of response. It's going to have grasses, weeds, briars, you know, stump sprouts, all of that. And now we also have a food plot right there created in that area as well. All right, so basically you see our roads. We're going to come down the very edge of the property line, slip around. We can get to that food plot and hunt it from the north or hunt it from the south. We've got different access points there. Then you come down right below that, you see this other purple shape, that's also going to be savanna as well. Well, that just created a huge corridor that is not on my road where I'm accessing. I just created a corridor going from the food plot to the south, going to the food plot to the north. Now I have deer travel, deer going back and forth through that area. Now the black shapes, those are just going to be your standard thinning. You know, reduce it down to 60 basal area or 80 basal area if you're going more for timber production. But if you're going for wildlife, 60 basal area. So we don't want deer all right there beside our roads. You see how everything is pretty well stacked back into the middle of the property. All right, now we've got the blue shapes, which is going to be heavier than the 60. Those blue shapes actually had a hardwood component to it. So we're going to probably about 40 to 50% of the trees in that area. And if they're pines, we're going to cut those. Those are dead. They're not coming back. But if they're hardwood species that we want to come back, like the dogwoods, the maples, the elms, we're just going to flush cut them. Don't treat them. Don't do anything to them. Flush cut them. Let them be deer food. And then trees where they're a little more aggressive. They're really not great for deer food, like sweet gum, poplar. Those types of trees, we're actually going to just hack and squirt. We don't have to cut them. If they're big enough to cut when the timber crew's there, let them cut them. But if they're not, we just hack and squirt. We just kill them standing. And then that canopy that they had now dies, and sunlight goes through there, and just little pieces of them fall at times, and then finally the whole tree falls. A couple of fires running through there, you're cleaning it all up.
You're also securing future oak production. I mean, oaks can't reproduce in closed canopy forests, so when you open it up and create a savanna, they're shade intolerant, so they have to have full sunlight for acorns to sprout. And so once you open it up, then you've allowed that property to start making the next generation of oaks. And I see that's a problem on just about every property we go on.
A lot of times people they are so scared to cut their timber. Like they've got some big, beautiful white oak timber, red oak timber, whatever, and they literally preserve their timber to death. They go out there trying to save these trees, and by trying to save them and never cut them, they basically wind up, their next forest that comes back is usually going to be poplar or something else, because the oaks need that sunlight. They can't reproduce and have seedlings without that sunlight. And most of the time when you have timber, you don't just have big white oaks. You've got a mid-story there too. And that mid-story is usually going to be your elm and different stuff like that. Beech,
maple.
Yeah, and so when you go out there and maybe you don't cut them, maybe you have a tornado come through, comes and wipes out all your white oaks. Well, now your next forest is going to be maple, beech, elm, and guess what? You're not going to replace that forest with fire, because those trees that are left, they don't carry fire very well. A lot of those trees, their leaves are flat. They'll lay close to the ground, and when they hit the ground, they deteriorate quickly. They stay wet. They hold moisture. Whereas the oak leaves, they hit the ground, they'll curl up. You walk in through oaks, it's going to be crunchy. Those type of leaves will carry a fire, and so
they last on the ground a whole lot longer. They don't break down.
That's exactly right. And so we've got to preserve our forest for the future. You've got to cut some trees, and sometimes that means cutting some white oaks, and that is absolutely okay. You can cut white oaks. It's not going to hurt you. Like I said, closed canopy timber is only producing 150 pounds at best per year. And white oaks don't even drop every year. You may get 3 out of 5 good years. Maybe not even that. Sometimes it's less than that.
And they're not even reaching their full potential usually when they're competing with each other. So, I mean, if you think about where you've seen the most, I mean, just the ground covered in acorns, it's usually where an oak tree, it's like, I think of my granddad's front yard where the only tree is an oak tree. I mean, the ground, you'll roll your ankle on it if there's so many. But that's because when oaks don't have competition, they can really start producing mast. And that's usually not the case when they're having to compete in the closed canopy forest.
Yeah. And then another thing too is what I've done on a lot of my properties where I had big, gigantic, the story I was telling you about with Kyle Lybarger when we first met. I mean, white oaks after white oak after white oak that you can't reach around. Well, guess what? When you've got 20 acres that look like that, that's difficult to hunt. And so basically what I did is I left about 5 acres that looked exactly like that. I actually didn't even touch it. Didn't cut a single tree out of it. And then right next to it, I cut that a little bit harder. Well, now I've got a transition line right there where I didn't cut and where I did cut. Perfect place to set up for the stand. Then you have another section of it. You go back and you cut it a little bit different too. Then you go around, maybe you clear cut a section of it. So now I have all of these different aspects. Each little border that I created, that's a transition zone. That's somewhere deer are going to travel. You got some places that are going to be bedding, some places are going to be feeding. I can differentiate and have a whole lot better idea of where I'm going to hunt because I've cut it in that manner. Whereas if I'd have just gone through and cut the whole entire 20 acres to say, let's just cut all trees that are 20 inches. Well, now where's the diversity? Where are the transitions? You don't have them. It's going to be random again. So make sure when you're cutting the timber, you're not just going through with that same approach across the whole entire thing. You can break it up, make it to where it's huntable. Like, you need to cut the timber, you need the money, but at the same time, make it to where don't go in there and cut the timber and then make it even harder to hunt. So
Diversity, that's always.
diversity is always the key.
Yeah, if you're ever questioning how to burn, be diverse about it. How to, when you're cutting timber, when you're burning, diversity is always going to make a property a whole lot better. So.
And the biggest aspect this farm didn't have was old field. I like to see an old field aspect on any property. I mean, if you care about turkeys, quail, and even deer, like your old field management is extremely crucial. That's where a lot of your quail and turkey are trying to nest and brood. And depending on when it was burned, it may be better brooding habitat or it may be better nesting habitat. But we need all of that on the property to be able to attract those birds and actually give them a place to live. Because if you're just going through there and wiping that out with a bush hog every single year, then it's not going to be, you're going to start seeing a decline in turkeys. And then not only that, a lot of these plants that we posted up here a while ago, most of those plants, it takes them nearly the whole entire year to go through their whole life cycle and to produce their seed. There's some that'll bloom early, there's some that'll bloom in the middle, and there's some that'll bloom at the end. But if we're going through there with a bush hog and we're mowing those things down repeatedly, a lot of those plants, they can only survive so long with that bush hog hitting them before they've made their flower. The perennial ones that's got roots, they'll be okay. But a lot of times we're going through there and promoting the non-native grasses that we don't want that are actually detrimental to turkeys, like the Bahia grass, Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, fescue. By mowing at multiple times throughout the year, you're actually telling your fields to start converting back over to grasses that can actually handle that type of disturbance. And so mowing or burning or disking later in the fall, after all those plants have had time to senesce, go through their whole entire reproductive system and lay those seeds, not only did you add a lot of food to the property, but now you've got all that cover, and then you've also got places for turkeys to nest and brood in.
Yeah, and those flowers that are flowering late, they're creating seeds a lot later, and in my opinion, that's even more important that they're dropping their seeds late in the season, because that's right before winter when wildlife are really going to need them. So if you're mowing, you're only getting things that are flowered in the spring. Their seeds have dropped on the ground, and who knows what's happened to them in the 6 months until it gets the winter. So
yeah, baby turkeys and quail, they're not eating seeds. A lot of people think they're eating seeds. There's a time in their life where they are eating seeds, but the baby turkeys and quail are living off of insects. And so what insects are attracted to is that old field scenario where you've got a lot of different flowers, like those flowers that they're attracting all the pollinators. They're coming in there and walking through there. The structure of a lot of those plants too, if you think about a fescue field or a Bahia grass or a lot of your non-native grasses, they're really, really thick at the ground level. Like you can't see dirt between the grass. Well, a lot of those plants that we just listed right there, when they grow up, they come up from a stick and then have like an umbrella effect to them. So stuff can move underneath them through it, especially baby turkeys and quail, and move through there, catching insects, and then they're also hidden from avian predators. And then if you've got edge feathering around the edge of your food plots, so taking some trees and felling them, either open edge feather where you're dropping them towards the food plot perpendicular, or closed edge where you're dropping it parallel to the food plot, then the turkey poults that are out there in that wildlife opening, if a predator like a coyote or a bobcat tries to get after them, well, the first thing they do is they dive off through that edge feather that you've just created, and that coyote, he can't penetrate that stuff very fast. And that gives them time, maybe they can't fly, but that gives them time, they can run through that stuff, hop up, get to a limb that they can't be reached. So like, you're protecting them by adding all of this to the property, and you're not having to do anything other than just maintain it once it's done.
Yeah, and those taller grasses and forbs, it's like a tiny forest for a quail, and then they're protected from aerial predators as well. So it's important to have those tall grasses, and also, just like your forest, manage your grasslands and your open fields differently. You don't have to manage all of them the same. So burning different times of the year, you're promoting different species. Usually burning in the fall is going to promote more wildflowers. Burning in the spring is going to promote more native warm season grasses. And you want grasslands that are at different stages. So a lot of those species that were listed on there are species that come back after disturbance. And so those are your ones that are going to fill in real fast. and establish quickly. But then it takes 3 or 4 years for your perennial species to really fill in. So, I mean, I planted a field, that was 3 or 4 years ago, that person's front yard. The first year it was solid Bidens, and I mean, half that list was there, but it was just solid yellow. And then this year there was hardly any of those Bidens or early successional stuff. It was mostly rattlesnake master and wild bergamot and some of those species that take 3 or 4 years to establish. So when you have those grasslands at different stages, there's something that's palatable to a deer at different times, and the chances of you having something on your property that your neighbor doesn't is going to be a whole lot better. They don't have to go anywhere else for what they need, and all this is applicable on public land as well, as long as they're burning and whatnot. So I feel like that's a good tip, is find out when
power line right-of-ways on public land is where you see a lot of this stuff. Like the power lines, they've done a really, really good job at managing the timber by not allowing anything to grow up in it. And a lot of times these power lines are in remote places, so nobody's gone in there and planted or bush hogged and sprayed a bunch of chemicals in there. So you really get a lot of awesome plant on these power line right-of-ways because it's just been kept open and not disturbed in the wrong way.
Yeah, the right kind of disturbance.
That's why the power line right-of-ways are really, really good. But, you talked about yesterday, like, you can also look for disturbances of nature, a tornado, a windstorm, beetles. Maybe a fire got away and got too hot, killed a whole bunch of big trees. All those different types of things will create a lot of this habitat that we're talking about. And so those are the things that I go and seek when I'm looking at public land. Like whatever I try to create here, that's what I go and look for when I'm on public ground. So finding that thick cover with food in it, recognizing the food, you don't walk through there. Everybody knows how to look for acorns and everything, but a lot of times people don't realize how much deer are actually feeding on woody browse. And woody browse, they're feeding on it just about year round. Even in ag country, woody browse is king. Even in ag country, it's been shown that they're still eating 80% woody browse. And so that's how important it is on your property. I don't care if you can plant some really good soybean food plots, you're not changing the herd by planting some awesome soybeans on your food plots. You're changing the herd because all of the natives and stuff, they're coming out at a time when soybeans aren't available. A lot of times, most places, soybeans are planted in May, sometimes in June. Well, a lot of the deer have already got half of their rack already expressed by the time soybeans are even in the ground. We were on Jacob's property last year, and his uncle was trying to plant some soybeans on this, really, really awesome prairie remnant. Kyle got there, and I noticed a couple of plants, and man, this is really cool. And Kyle's over there just nerding out. There was probably, 50 different species of native legumes in a 2-acre patch, and all of the native legumes were probably knee-high. Some maybe even waist high. Some of them aren't very, very tall growing, but they were really thick this high. And you look over there at his soybean patch, and it kind of looked like that concrete floor right there. They were really, really struggling to survive because the deer were hammering them. The ones that were up, they might have had 2 leaves, and they're 2 inches tall. And that's not going to feed or change your deer. Yes, protein. There's a lot of protein in the soybeans, but it's not being able to provide what the native was providing.
Yeah, they're adapted to those soils. So even among the same species, there's butterfly weed out there everywhere. If you took a butterfly weed from that property and took it to Nebraska, it's not going to do nearly as well. And vice versa. If you took one from Nebraska, put it down here, grew it at the same time with an Alabama ecotype one, Alabama one's going to just thrive. These native plants are, even amongst the same species, are adapted to our soil types. And you can tell if you try to plant one that's used to Alabama soils in another state, they just don't do as well. So those natives, they don't, then you start comparing them to a soybean. These plants are already adapted to what's there.
Yeah, and having diverse food on the property, soybeans is just one thing. A lot of those different plants that we showed up there, that they have different phosphorus levels, different calcium levels. And so the deer need all of those different things, and they know what they need, and they're seeking that out. So if you have it on the farm, you're going to see them nibble a tip here, nibble a tip there. Anytime you've watched deer in the woods, they're usually not just feeding on acorns. They're usually nibbling on other stuff too, and start paying attention to what they're eating on. start looking for that. Start looking for the stems. You'll walk through an area and like you see some green stuff, and you'll start seeing just little bitty sticks of where the plant used to be. That's where the deer were eating that. And so those are the things you start focusing on, looking for. And once you see deer feeding on it one time, you recognize it. Take out your phone, take a picture of it. If you don't know what it is, look at it, put on iNaturalist or Seek, and start learning those native plants that the deer are eating on, and start looking for those. And you know, a lot of times where you want to look for them is where you got sunlight. So,
yeah, we're going to do a Q&A now, I think. So, if anybody has any questions.
So I own 13 acres behind my house.
yeah.
Would you recommend just a savanna for the whole 13? Because it's not big enough to really break up into, you know, early successional and then, you know, a small, you know, a big timber. Just basically, should I just turn it all into a savanna?
Man,
I'm probably going to put in a food plot, you know, acre or two food plot. But
that's the thing. I would not do all of one thing. If your whole entire property, even if it's small, I would still break things up, just like we talked about. If you do all one thing, then you're limited to that one thing. And so if you break it up, maybe do some savanna aspect to it, maybe do some where it's a little bit thicker, and then also have a food component as well. That's going to give you more usable space on the property as opposed to just one thing. Diversity is key.
I hunt several states, and one of them is Pennsylvania in the northwestern part, and we get a lot of lake effect snow. And is there a good resource for finding places where we can maybe get the seeds to reestablish a lot of these native plants?
Yeah, Pennsylvania has the largest native seed producer in the country, Ernst Seeds. They're based out of Pennsylvania, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got lucky, so.
Yeah.
That was an awesome talk, thanks. So I'm just getting started. Where's the Bible for me to learn these plants? What do I need to do to dig in to learn so that I can see it when I'm out scouting?
Craig Harper's got a really good book. I can't remember the name of it. You know the name of it?
It's the one that's about food plots, but then half of it's about native plants.
Yeah.
It's something food plots. I can't remember.
Craig Harper's got a good book. iNaturalist, like anytime you're in the woods, start using iNaturalist. It's an app, and so go through there and you see a plant, start taking pictures of that plant, learn what that plant was, especially if you see deer browse. If you see deer eating on it, figure out what that plant is. And then you take a picture of it in iNaturalist, and then you can also look on iNaturalist and you can see, you know, who all else has seen that picture in your location and stuff like that. But that's a really good app to learn the plants in the field. And to me, that's the best way, because a lot of times when you're looking at a picture in a book, I don't feel like it's giving you as good of a representation of the picture, because it may be at a different growth stage. And so sometimes it's hard to find. Like sometimes if a plant doesn't have a flower on it, it's a lot harder to identify. So using that app, you're able to take a picture of the leaf, the shape of the leaf and all that kind of stuff, and that'll help you understand it a lot more. And you start learning it, you can even keep a record of what all you found, and then once you find the plant, then go back and Google the name of that plant and see how it relates to deer habitat or turkeys or whatever.
Yeah. I was going to say too, I mean, in Alabama, we've got over 4,000 native plant species, so it's hard to find a source that's going to have all that. Although we do have the Alabama Native Plant Atlas online, so it does have everything listed and what counties they're found in. But like on Allen and ours, we own some property that borders each other. Like the deer are hammering Alabama larkspur, and that's a species that's only found in Alabama. So like those, if you get a book or something, it's not going to have that kind of plant in there.
I had that picture on there. I was going to let you talk about all the flowers and stuff.
Jacob's uncle's place has Alabama croton. That's found 2 counties in the world. Like it's so each property is going to have things that other properties aren't. So iNaturalist is usually the best bet.
Yeah, and you just start learning them that way. I mean, that's the best way to do it, is actually going out there, seeing it, and then recognizing it.
All right, so if you got old food plots on your place and you want to reestablish some native, or maybe establish some native browse on there, what's the best way to go about that?
So sometimes, in some cases, we actually prescribe to put a food plot out there to get rid of whatever non-native stuff you may have, especially if you got some really tough perennial ones that are hard to get rid of. Sometimes you can plant a food plot and like soybeans even, like you're going to spray Roundup a couple times, like spray the stuff out, and then that fall go and plant your native seed into it.
That's when you're trying to find a place to put a food plot. Target target the spots that have a lot of the bases, not the spots that already have good stuff. So
Yeah.
But
Figure out what's in your field now, like what you have growing now. Most of the time when we're prescribing, like a native, you're going to buy a blend from Roundstone or wherever that will look a lot like this. This is actually a place that I just managed this way. I did not plant a single seed and got a crazy good response just by burning. But some areas have been disturbed so much in the wrong way that you don't have this seed bank left anymore. What you have is a lot of non-native stuff. And so in that situation, it's going to take 2 or 3 applications of herbicide to get rid of what you have there, so that when you plant your diverse native blend, you're not competing with all that. Like, because if you plant a whole bunch of legumes and you've got a really bad broadleaf weed, well, you can't spray that broadleaf weed anymore. Same thing if you've got a grass weed. If you're trying to plant native warm season grasses, you got a whole bunch of Kogan grass or Johnson grass. Then, well, Johnson grass has got chemicals now you can use, but sometimes you're limiting yourself by not being able to spray because you planted the same chemicals going to kill that kills your invasive.
Where's the best place to buy seeds
yeah,
from?
I'll answer that, and then I'll touch on something else too. In the southeast, we're kind of screwed because there's like no native seed producers other than Roundstone in Kentucky. So Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, Mississippi, there's no native seed producers. We got to go to Kentucky. Went out west and northeast, like every state has a native seed producer. It's crazy. But so Roundstone is growing seeds. Alabama Ecotype seeds now. They've got some Georgia coastal Ecotype stuff, some Arkansas. So that's probably going to be your best bet. And when you call them, just tell them what you're trying to manage for and where you're from, and they can sometimes get you local Ecotype stuff. Also, I wanted to touch on the seed bank. So, the seed bank is like, those are, native species that have been in the soil. Their seeds have been in the soil for sometimes decades. And once you burn and expose that seed bank again, a lot of times it's either under piles of leaf litter, acting just like mulch in your flower bed, or it's under a bunch of thatch. When you burn, that seed bank can now express itself. There's also what we call root banks, which there's a property I burned last year that for the past 4 or 5 years it's had some rare plants that, they put on basil leaves, but they get that tall and they don't flower, they don't go to seed. Now that we burned it, exposed that seed bank, but also brought in a ton of sunlight because I ran an absolute rager of a fire through there in the summer. It was hot. I killed a bunch of trees, but now there's sunlight in there, and now those flowers that have just been hanging on, barely, not even able to flower, are now like coming up and flowering and making tons of seeds. So there's like thousands of them. So thousands of plants went from doing nothing to now actually doing something for wildlife, creating seeds, and that's all because we brought sunlight in. So
yeah, another place like for public land guys, I was just thinking about, glades are really, really slow at growing trees. So in the south, we have a lot of rainfall, trees grow really, really fast. It turns into forest extremely quick. If you just let a field like that go, it'd be forest in 5 years. And you'd start getting to the point where you can't even get a bush hog through it. You want to bring a mulcher in. But glades, or even sandier soil, a lot of times the growth habits of trees, they're really, really slow. And so like if you think of a property that you've been on, a public land property with a glade on it, go check that glade out. A lot of times you'll find a lot of these plants that are actually doing really well because they can survive in that really, really thin soil way better than a lot of the plants that we think of for food plots and stuff. And deer are actually hammering those plants. And it's kept open because, well, nobody could farm it, nobody could use it, nobody could do anything with it, and then the soil structure of it and everything didn't allow trees to just completely shade it out. So it's almost like a natural place that is continued to stay open and will have a lot of these plants on it.
Yeah, and if you're hunting public land, there's a good reason to go talk to the biologist and ask, hey, do you have any of these places? Or have you done a timber harvest this year? Do you plan to do one? Have you done one in the past 2 years? Where have y'all been burning this year? Where did you burn last year? Ask those types of questions, and you can find out where this habitat might possibly be, and that's going to save you some time when you're out scouting.
Yeah, and early successional is key because the first year is going to be better, like the highest quality of food. The second year it can have kind of both. The third year it turns into pretty much just cover. Like it's not a ton of food. So a 3-year disturbance, 3 to 5 year, people know like a 3 to 5 year old cutover, it starts playing out. That 6 to 10 to 12 year period, it's pretty well useless. So look for that on your maps as well. Like look for those early successional stages.
Okay, you talk about disturbing the soil. What's the preferred method? Would you plow it under? I mean, you already mentioned burning, you mentioned herbicides, kill it off. So, if you want to get those native grasses going again, what's your preferred method there?
My preferred method is definitely going to be burning. Sometimes we don't always get everything we want, or sometimes you may have even native grasses that will just get way too thick and rank and kind of keep all that other stuff from coming up. So if you have a situation like that, we'll do a fall disc, and I'm not talking about plowing. I'm talking about lightly disc. All you want to do is basically just disturb a little bit of the soil, like 25 to 30% of the soil being disturbed. That'll kind of like set back some of that grass, and then those little bare pockets and stuff is where, in the fall. Don't do it in the spring or summer, because that's going to promote grasses, but in the fall, you're going to promote more forbs and legumes and stuff. So like a little bit of soil disturbance with a disc can be good. Sometimes I even prescribe to do just a few strips through a old field area that looks just like that. That'll also kind of create you have one set of plants that are maybe chest high, and then when the spot where you disc, they may get only like knee high that year. So that kind of gives you that diversity, sort of sets some of the stuff back, and like gives you multiple, like you've got brooding right next to nesting.
Second question, like we have shelter cut some of the, select cut some of our properties. I mean, it almost sounds like it probably just needs to be clear cut and let it grow back up, So what's your thoughts on that?
It depends. I mean, what's coming back. A lot of times, if you do a shelter cut and you don't do any disturbance afterwards, then it's probably going to be a lot more work. Typically, anytime we do a timber harvest, we're either going to burn to maintain, and in some cases, we have to burn and use herbicide. So some trees are just not going to be killed by the fire. You may kind of set them back a little bit, but you're just not going to kill them. And in those cases, like you'll follow up 2 years after a timber harvest and come through with a backpack sprayer and spray the trees out that you don't want to, so that you can keep that canopy opening 30% or more.
All right, everybody. That's going to wrap up this segment of this seminar. If you have any other questions, feel free to come up to the guys and talk to them afterwards, both Alan and Kyle. And again, Alan and Kyle, we greatly appreciate you all joining us at the Mobile Hunters Expo. Appreciate everybody sitting in the audience. And in about 15 minutes, actually, we have a push-up competition between myself, Michael Perry, and Daniel Lemon from Do-It-Yourself Hunters. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be pretty entertaining.
Thank y'all.
Yeah, thanks.